Good evening, everyone. We will start our class. Our class this week is connected to the parsha and the upcoming holidays of Purim time. The beauty of this period of time, this Jewish year, as it happens, we have 2 months of Adar, 2 months of the month of Adar, spelled Adar, and in the second of the month, being that it's the Jewish leap year, we will celebrate Purim. Now, we're going to delve into Purim, but we're also going to connect it back to this week's parsha, this week's Torah reading, as well as connected to some special event which has happened this week. But that part will leave us a surprise till we get there. So, firstly, we're going to discuss the idea of that. We're going to the idea of the month of Adar, and in particular, I did mention that this year is a Jewish leap year with 2 months of the same, which gives us 60 days rather than 30 days to understand what's so special about this month and to have the special effects of this month. So the first thing that we're going to try to understand is to understand what's so special about this month. I did mention we have the festival of Purim, and we know that this month was deliberately chosen by Haman, the evil man involved and prime minister of the time when the Jews were at the time of Purim, and he wanted to carry out a terrible decree to annihilate every Jewish man, woman, and child in the kingdom. But he blundered. He thought that he was picking a date, but he didn't really understand what was the true import of the date. And that led to the Jews being saved from his decree and gives us the holiday of Purim. In the notes that we've got, and the Megillah, which is the scroll which tells us the narrative of the story of Purim, the scroll of Esther describes the entire background to Haman's decree against the Jews. And we're going to read a little bit together of that background. Jerry, would you like to read over in source 1?
Yes, you ready?
Yeah.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted and advanced Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and placed his seat above all the princes with him. And all the king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and prostrate themselves before Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself. When Haman saw Mordecai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself before him, Haman became full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible to him to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him Mordecai's nationality. And Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman every day and every month to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar.
Okay, so that gives us of the basic background. And then we're going to find out from another part of the narrative of the scroll. We're going to understand, based on some extra material from Jewish Talmud, that discusses the idea of what was happening behind Haman's thoughts at that time when he did do the lot. He did a lottery for himself to try to find out what day he thinks he would be the most successful, as we just read about. So we'll come to source 2. Carl, do you want to do source 2?
Sure, why not? The verse states they cast pur, that is the lot. A sage taught the following bereta. Once the lot fell on the month of Adar, he, Haman, greatly rejoiced, for he saw this as a favorable omen for the execution of his plans. He said, the lot has fallen for me in the month that Moses died, which is consequently a time of calamity for the Jewish people. But he did not know that not only did Moses die on the 7th of Adar, he was also born on the 7th of Adar.
Okay, so let's continue with this. So an explanation of that. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in one of his talks, took this portion of the Talmud and the original narrative of Haman's thoughts, and he started to dissect it somewhat to try to understand what was behind Haman's thought, Haman's joy, and that its point in time. So I'll read this section. Haman's joy. The Talmud tells us that two events took place on the 7th of Adar. In fact, the great leader of the Jewish nation, Moses, the 7th of Adar, the 7th day of Adar, is the birth of Moses, as well as the passing of Moses, Moses' Yahrzeit. When Haman wanted to designate a month or a day for the decree against the Jews, and he wanted to put forward that to the king Ahasuerus, the king of Persia at the time, he didn't want to rely on his own decision-making. Therefore, he looked to astrology. He looked to some sort of issue which is beyond his logic to see if he could try to find his most optimum day. He cast a lottery to know, as we say, in which month he would be successful. He cast this lot, as explained by one of the commentaries, because he wanted to make sure that he had success. And the Talmud discusses that and says that when he made that lottery for himself, it fell out on the month of Adar. He was very happy because he knew, he rejoiced because he realized that it had fallen in the month of Moshe's death. In other words, Haman knew that even with casting a lottery, his success wouldn't be certain. But when he saw that it had fallen in the month of Adar, he rejoiced. Why was that? Because the lot had fallen for himself in the month that Moses died. And he knew that Moses was the redeemer of Israel. Moses was the one who took the Jews out of Egypt, had the miracles that we discuss in our Purim, in our Pesach time. He had won victories of war against Paro, against Amalek, against other nations, and that he was a redeemer. But that he died on a particular date, right? And his plot was going to be consumed on the day of his Yahrzeit. That result led him to conclude that his plot would succeed. But the Talmud says but he did not know that not only did Moses die on the 7th of Adar, but he was also born on the 7th of Adar. And therefore, one of the great commentary on the Talmud named Rashi says that a birth is worthy enough to atone for any of the negativities that comes by a death. And that is the prelude to the eventual miracles that happen that comprise the story of Esther. Now, we can ponder, is death better than birth? This teaching that birth is worthy enough to atone for death requires some sort of clarification. We need to understand it from a textual perspective and a logical perspective. In Torah study, proof for a given matter can be brought either from a text or some logic. Sometimes when something is spelled out clearly in the Torah's text, no logical explanation is needed. And sometimes no textual basis is necessary in our case. Both text and logic seems to contradict the Talmud. But in our particular case, we have one text which says the day is one death is better than the day is one birth. And there's a logic to that. The logic can be that a person understands that at death, a person's life comes to an end. And we'll be able to recognize and appreciate the accomplishments of his lifetime. But that's not the case upon a person's birth. You have a clean slate. We have absolutely no idea what the new baby will accomplish. So we must also take into account that every person is created with two inclinations, a good and a bad, and we don't know which one is going to succeed in his life. So therefore, teachings tells us that the soul, the Jewish soul, comes from a high place, and when it's born and brought into this world, it comes to a low spiritual physical pit, and it experiences in its lifetime what might be called a dangerous journey, but with God's assistance, he helps and he navigates it. But if so, then the question sort of comes back from the beginning. Why does the Talmud say that the birth is worthy enough to atone for a death? Both the Torah and logic suggest that the date of birth is not necessarily worthy enough to overshadow a day of death, and which is the culmination of a person's accomplishment. So why did the Talmud say that a date of birth is more worthy? And at most, we should say that the death reveals the value of a birth. When a person passes away, this is the culmination of a person's entire life. We're able to appreciate the value of his birthday. But a birthday alone should nullify any of the effects of death. How do we know that should be transformed into a holiday because of also his birthday? Let's try to examine and understand that. Let's try and understand where that differential might be. Let's try to understand that when a person is in his next sphere, where in his completion of his days, that is his Yahrzeit, right? Why do we see that one is better than the other? So, Jerry, would you like to continue? Page 8, where it says the Rebbe.
Okay, the Rebbe. Death is better than birth. Now, this teaching, the birth is worthy enough to atone for the death, requires clarification, both from a textual perspective and a logical perspective. In Torah study.
Yeah, Jerry, we just did that section. Do you want a little bit further, page 8?
Hold on, let me find where I'm at.
Yeah.
Starts another question, says?
Are you going to, read from another question. That's a good place.
I see. Okay. Another question. The Alter Rebbe writes that a day of a righteous person's passing is a special moment when all of his accomplishments come to fore. If so, when the Talmud seeks to explain how the lots on the 7th of Adar was actually a benefit, it should have said that the Yahrzeit of Moses, the most outstanding of men, is most beneficial day to bring salvation to the Jewish people and abolish Haman's decree. This is not a question of Haman himself. He rejoiced when the lots fell on the month of Moses' death because he didn't know the value of a Yahrzeit. But why did the Talmud note this idea as the reason for our salvation?
So Yahrzeit is the day of death. Right? So essentially our question is, why did the Talmud say that the idea that, well, the day of his death is not so good, but the day of his birth is better? Surely the day of the Yahrzeit is the day when all the accomplishments come to fruition of a person's life. So why doesn't the Talmud note that this idea is also a reason for our salvation? Why does it go to the idea of birthday in particular? Okay, so that's our question at the moment. That's what we're focusing on. Okay.
Should I read the next?
Carl, do you want to do this next section?
Moses
is different?
Moses is different. I have to say this is fascinating. The explanation, everything we explained about the disadvantage of the day of birth, that it is impossible to know a person's accomplishment, and that the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth, because at birth, his virtues are only in potential. This is true for ordinary people. However, with Moses' birth, as soon as he entered the world, his contribution was immediate and apparent. The Torah says, she realized how extraordinary he was when he was born. The entire house was filled with light.
This happens to be a reference to Moses' mother, that she noticed when he was born, the entire house was filled with light. Please continue.
Yes. As soon as Moses was born, before his birth, before being named, and obviously before he had any personal accomplishments, the home was filled with his radiance.
So we're getting a hint at this point that Moses' birth, the leader of the Jewish people, the greatest of all prophets, his birth was something of major significance. As it says, his home was the home of Moses was filled with an internal light, with his Moses, the new baby's radiance. Certainly, I'm sure if you have children, you know that when your children were born, the house was filled with a lot of noise and crying. But but there was also a lot of radiance.
Oh, yes.
A new child came to the one. But this is not just a new child. This is the Redeemer of all Israel. So, Jerry, do you have source 3?
Yes. The woman became pregnant and had a son. She realized how extraordinary the child was, and she kept him hidden for 3 months. Rashi, how extraordinary he was when he was born. The entire house was filled with light.
Okay, so the whole idea that a newborn, and in particular the Redeemer of Israel, is born and that fills a house with light, shows us that the day of his birth is something, not just a matter of something potential, but something that happened when he was born. Let's continue reading. Carl, do you have that section?
Yes. The uniqueness of this matter is further emphasized when one realizes that this took place in Amram's house. Amram was the greatest of his generation, so much so that Moses is sometimes called the son of Amram, indicating that his prominence and pedigree stemmed from being Amram's son. And despite Amram's virtue, the entire house was filled with light when Moses was born.
Continue.
Okay, there must have been a light in Amram's house even before Moses was born, and not just any light, but a radiance appropriate for the greatest man of the generation. However, there are many degrees of light. There is the light of a candle, the light of a torch, the light of the fire, sunlight, the light of Messianic era, and the supreme spiritual light created on the first day of creation. These levels are obviously incomparable to each other.
Let me just take a little break in there to
Sure.
fill in some of the gaps of potential knowledge over there. When we talk about light, we're talking about physical light, but we're also talking about spiritual light. You know, sometimes when a person explains something to you, you say, "Oh, I was in the dark." But now that you've explained something to me, you know, the light's being turned on. I've got a realization. Sometimes when we don't know our passage in the world and we're confused, we say we're in the dark. We're in the dark. When we see our purpose and see a vision, see a commercial opportunity or a personal, individualized opportunity for a more meaningful light, we say that there is a light. So over here, what we're saying is that there is a light of a candle, and even a dark room, a candle changes the entire atmosphere. You see where you're going. You won't bump into the furniture, right? You can see where you are. When a torch goes on, you've got a much more stronger light. In the light of a fire, you can see for a distance. In the middle of the day, you have a very strong light. Each one of those can be representative of a personal level of enlightenment that you can achieve. There is something that we talk about, which is part of our Jewish knowledge, the desire for the Messianic era, where there will be spiritual light, physical light, but spiritual light, so that everybody will see with their physical eyes, but with also their spiritual eyes. They'll see the beauty of everything that exists. As it says, the lion will lie down with the sheep. And then there was the era of the initial creation, when God first created the world, where he put everything in the world, and everything was of great levels of spirituality, as everything brand new is. And that existed on the first day. There was man and the original, and there was his sin in the Gan Eden of Eden, which decreased our level of appreciation of spirituality. Now, when something new comes into the world, a new light comes into the world. True, every single human being adds their personal light. And we'll talk about that as we get along in the class. But when a leader, when a very special neshama, when a very special soul comes into the world, then something new that didn't exist before comes into this world. And that's what we're talking about at the moment. So, Carl, you want to continue?
Yes. This is the emphasis of our sages in their statement that when he was born, the entire house was filled with light. The birth of Moses didn't only add light to the home or bring it to a higher degree of radiance. Rather, he brought such radiance that the previous state seemed completely dark. Should I continue?
Yeah, please.
With this in mind, there is obviously no room for the question of why his birth overrides his day of death. For an ordinary person, a birthday has no value because the individual has yet to make a contribution. But Moses made an immediate contribution the moment he was born by illuminating his entire home.
Absolutely. So we can understand that when a leader, a totally righteous man, is born, he brings into this world something that didn't exist before, and that new light fills the world and gives it strength. With this, we can understand something that Haman, the evil Haman, didn't perceive. He didn't know, and therefore this is what the Talmud was teaching us. But we want to delve into this a little bit further. So, Jerry, do you have the source for?
Yes. This explains why the day of his birth atones for the day of death. The fact that the home was filled with light from the moment of his birth demonstrates that his entire being from the moment of birth was the light of the Torah. Therefore, the day of birth could atone for the day of death. Even if there is a day of death from a physical perspective, the day of birth continues to emanate with the light of his Torah, the eternity of Torah and mitzvot overriding and atoning for the day of death.
I can see if I can put in over here. So therefore, when we spoke previously about Moses' achievements, we spoke about the miraculous capabilities of the story of Pesach, of taking the Jews out of Egypt. But the whole purpose of the Jewish nation coming out of Egypt was, as the verse tells us, so that Moses could lead us to Mount Sinai, and where at Mount Sinai, God could reveal himself, not just in the miraculous way that he did with Pharaoh, but he revealed himself with his laws, with the 10 Commandments, with the tools that we can utilize, each individual, to make a difference in the world, to make that person's birth utilized to make it a place for God. And that's what the Torah, God's wisdom, God's rules, God's laws that he gave us at Har Sinai, gave us at the Mount of Sinai, gave to us and achieved. So his birth was a prelude to all the achievements that he was going to do, in particular, in the light of his Torah, the eternity of Torah and mitzvahs and the commandments which Hashem has given us. And that overrides and that equivalently atones for when a person leaves this world, because after all, what is the day of death? And the day of death is the person when a person has completed their role in this world, having achieved what they've achieved, and moving on to another level of existence. But with that has brought something, and Moses in particular brought the eternity of Torah and the capability of connecting to God via his Torah, by his teachings and his mitzvahs and his commandments to the world. And this is Moses' essence. So, Jerry, would you like to continue from where I stopped?
Yes.
Good.
This is because the Torah, which is Moses' essence, is alive and well. It continues to live on in the direct line of tradition and rabbinic ordination, which dates back to Moses and even after the ordination ceased. It lives on with the leaders of every generation who are called the Moses of the generation. As the Midrash says, there is no generation that does not have someone like Moses. Those progeny perpetuate Torah and mitzvot, the essence of Moses, and ensure its eternity. In other words, the eternity of the Torah is what atones for the day of death, rendering the day of his death meaningless. The Alter Rebbe explains that the kapara, atonement, means the total abolition of the sin, causing the individual to be beloved by God as he was before the sin. The same is true in our case. The day of the birth of Moses, which filled the home with light of Torah, atones for and eliminates the day of death. Death and change are only true in trivial matters. His true essence, the Torah, is eternal and is passed down from generation to generation by the leaders and scholars of the Jewish people in every generation.
Thank you. So Moses was one entity with Torah. We have an expression which we talk about when we mention Torah, but we also connect it to Moses, and we say the Moses is called from Torah's name, Torah's Moshe. That is to say, the entire entity of Moses was his connection to God through the Torah, and he gave us the Torah, gave us the law. Therefore, just as Torah lives on, just like God's wisdom is eternal, the Torah lives on. So Moses, who was one with Torah, also lives on, and his spirit lives on in every single leader amongst the Jewish nation. So when Haman was happy that the lot fell out on the month of Adar, because he said this is the month of Moses' passing, but the Talmud teaches us, and the Talmud, seeing through this idea of that the ultimate of the Yahrzeit is the birth, and they're all connected. The Talmud teaches us that the Haman failed to realize that Moses never really died. However, how do we know that he lived on? Because when he was born, his coming to the world filled the house with a new light. In other words, he was one with the Torah, the light of Torah, and therefore Moses could not die in a physical sense, yes, but in a spiritual sense. So in a letter to another organization, to a yeshiva in Montreal, which coincided with they had an event on the day of this birthday of Moshe Rabbeinu, the 7th of Adar, which was this week, and that's its connection to this week. Right?
Oh, wow.
Not this event, but the 7th day of Adar.
Right.
So the Rebbe in a letter explained part of this concept in quite simple terms. Let's read the letter together. Carl, I think it's your turn. So source 5.
Source. Oh, here we go. Yes. Okay. The Talmud says, once the lot fell on the month of Adar, Haman greatly rejoiced. He said, the lot has fallen from me in the month of that Moses died, but he did not know that he died on the 7th of Adar and was born on the 7th of Adar. The Talmud's conclusion is not understood. The death comes after the birth and overrides it. The explanation, Moses was the shepherd of the Jewish people. Before he was born, he was already designated to redeem the Israelites from Egypt and bring them to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. In every generation, when we recognize that we left Egypt and when we thank God for giving us the Torah, in present tense, the life and impact of Moses lives on. When his work lives on, he lives on as well.
Until today.
Excuse me?
Until today. So you completely, continue.
Yes, his impact. Did I miss something or?
Sorry, his impact is felt differentially.
Okay, his impact is felt differentially after his passing because it came through his students and representatives, but nevertheless, the day of his birth overrides and atones for his death and the change it engendered. The radiance of Moses began to shine from the moment of his birth, and it continues to shine, albeit differently, until today.
Okay, so let's summarize the thing to this point before we go to the next section. Some people invent new and great things. Some doctors, scientists develop groundbreaking medications or new insights. The list goes on, and their creations rise to prominence, but for a while. But it's inevitable that they will eventually fade away and become outdated. Someone else can come along and sweep the world with a new invention, a new idea. The same thing happens in the world of art. Same thing happens in the world of music and books. But Moses was an exception. Moses introduced to us and gave us the Torah, which the Jewish nation keeps to this day. And hence, the idea that Moses never died, the Torah lives on, and it's been for thousands of years. People have studied it and fulfilled all its commandments. This connection with Moses and his representative in every generation is eternal. And this marks the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu and all the other great people throughout history. All the others who've contributed have their contribution has been given, but something has moved on. And a legacy might be acknowledged, but somewhat its importance just put down in history books. But Moses didn't die because the Torah and the Jewish nation last forever. There's also true of our forefather Yaakov, who brought the Jewish nation to the world. And in fact, all the leaders of all the generations who are representative of Moshe Rabbeinu in their generation continue that legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu. In approximately around 2 months' time, Chabad around the world will be celebrating a milestone of 120 years since the Rebbe's birth. The Rebbe was the appointed leader of Chabad for the years following the Holocaust. And in that Holocaust, a vast proportion of our nations was exterminated. Following the Holocaust, traditional Judaism was on the decline. The strength of the European Judaism had been decimated. Spiritual leadership didn't know how to maintain what was left. But like Moses leading the people of Israel out of slavery, the Rebbe spearheaded a major Jewish revival, and he gave them hope, freedom, and the teachings of the Torah. Did not accept that the assertion that Jewish life was shrinking. And in fact, when the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe came to America, the first thing, and he met Jewish leaders, the first thing that they told him was that America is different. You won't be able to remake what was lost. But he had the strength to be able to say that America is not different, and it'll also be a place of Torah. And through the Rebbe himself, through the Rebbe, he brought the light of Judaism with love and without compromise. And one of the gifts that the Rebbe gave was the idea of the movement of sending rabbis all around, making Chabad houses everywhere, from people to Morocco to Australia. There are many Chabad houses, in fact, some more than 5,500, I understand, Chabad houses around the world. The Rebbe changed Judaism from something which didn't look like it had a future to something which is a matter of public pride. And he brought Judaism to the public square when we light Hanukkah menorahs with the mayor or whatever other dignitaries coming. This positive approach to Judaism is not the exclusive domain of just Chabad, but it has been spearheaded and was spearheaded by the Rebbe's approach. And this is what it says about Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, that it says our sages say about Jacob, and in a comment in the Talmud where it says Jacob did not die. So the Talmud makes the comment, says, but surely he was mourned, he was put in a coffin, and he was mourned for many days, as the Torah says. The Talmud answers and replies, just as his children are alive, so he is also alive. Now, this idea of leadership that's expressed and taught by the Rebbe and all his followers doesn't have to stop at the leader. But in fact, there's an aspect which relates to every single person. And that's the next part of our talk. Carl, would you like to read the next part? The Moses in you.
Oh, okay. The Rebbe, every Jew's spark. So with all these extensive explanations about the uniqueness of the 7th of Adar, we must ask, what is its relevance to 7th of Adar are we talking about today or this year?
Well, this is the date of the talk that the Rebbe
okay.
Originally said. This talk was he's quoting from the Rebbe at the moment, which was 1985. So the Rebbe said, what's its relevance to today? But we can ask that same question, right?
Today, sure.
What's its relevance to our date?
Right.
To ourselves. And that's the question that we need to ask ourselves every single day. I'll let you continue. The Alter Rebbe.
Yes. The Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that every soul has a spark of Moses within him. He explains that it is not something buried deep inside you like a precious treasure, but rather something that impacts your deeds, speech, and thought. Moses is in the Torah he bequeathed. In simple terms, when the most ordinary Jew recites the verse Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, he knows that it is a passage from the Torah of Moses. And he knows that the passage was passed down to him because Moses bequeathed the Torah as an inheritance to the Jewish people. If you ask him, do you believe that this passage was dear to Moses as well? Was this his identity and his essence? He will respond, absolutely.
And in fact, this is our basic prayer. Every school child, every child in Cheder, every child that goes to Jewish school, every person as a basis and a basic prayer, should say and can say the Shema Yisrael. And in this Shema Yisrael, right, is the essence of every single Jew. So Jerry, do you want to read this next section?
Sure. His own rabbi or teacher teaches him Torah with passion and excitement, despite being the student of a student of a student, etc., many generations displaced from the 40 generations of Torah's transmission. If so, this was certainly true of Moses. The Torah was his entire identity. It would be foolish, this fellow would say, to assume otherwise. The question is foolish altogether. You might ask him further, is passion in any given manner evidence that the matter is essential to you? Of course, he will respond. He knows it is from his own experience. When he engages with something with passion and with enthusiasm, it connects to his very soul. When it's a matter of Judaism, it connects to the deepest part of his godly soul, to whatever extent he could understand and perceive it. That being the case, he understands that when Moses transmitted the verse, Shema Israel, he also transmitted all his passion and enthusiasm, his essence. Thus, there is no novelty to the fact that he harbors a spark of Moses in his own heart. He knows that if he will only allow his spark of Moses to give an opinion or even take over, observing Torah and mitzvot will become a minor, easy endeavor.
In fact, it says in one of our sources that in the Talmud, it makes a comment that says that a person should have the love and fear of Moses, and the Gemara makes a comment: is this thing such an easy matter? And then it responds by saying that for Moshe Rabbeinu, it is an easy matter. That's the reference that he's making over here in the quote that we just read, meaning to say that if you can touch your spark of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher, inside of yourself, if you can harness that capability of yourself, then doing the Torah becomes a minor and easy endeavor, because you're connecting to your deepest level of connection to your spiritual soul, to your source, and therefore observing the Torah becomes an easy matter for you. So when a Jew says Shema Yisrael, and he knows that this is a verse that comes from the Torah, and that's the Torah which Moses invested his entire essence. Therefore, when he says a verse from the Torah given to him by Moses, and he connects with that verse, he becomes one with his soul, and he connects to the one who gave us the Torah, which is the essence of Moses, who was given the Torah by Hashem himself. And from that point of view, when you connect to that level, you connect to an essence and a core of the Jewish soul. It becomes simple, and it becomes to the point. So we can connect it very easily to this week and to the upcoming festival of Purim. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've got the 60 days of the 2 months of Adar to relate to it. We can connect to this idea. Who wants to do the next section?
Our light?
Yeah, take it away.
Okay, with, with that in mind, we can take the following lesson for 7 Adar this year. Every person in every generation and every situation has a spark of Moses within him. Therefore, when the day of 7 Adar arrives, one's home should be filled with light, one's home environment and all one's surroundings. When more and more people see this light and grasp the radiance shining within the universe, it serves to automatically nullify the darkness of exile and impurity. Our sages said that a little bit of light chases away a lot of darkness. How much more so in our case when there is a lot of light and only a little bit of darkness remains? And that's the end.
That's not the end, because that's the end of our text. But
Yes.
the end is that every single person can implement in some sort of way the beauty and the power of the day of the 7th of Adar, the week of the 7th of Adar, which we are presently in, and we can bring an extra level of light into our week, into our day, into Shabbat, and connect to that gift that Hashem has given us via his Torah. And the soul which each one of us has, and to inflame that spark, that candle, into a torch, into a flame, and into a light which ultimately lights up the whole house. And that affects the locale where you are. You're the neighbors in your street. You'll tell them, you'll give them a bright smile with a good morning, a good evening, and pass on the relevance, the beauty, the spiritual goodness in our souls. So we can celebrate another birthday. In 2 months' time will be the Rebbe's birthday on the 11th of Nisan. We can reconnect to the mission that he gave each and every one of us, that we should take the spark that we've got and transform it further into a brilliant light that guides us through our own light. And by that way, working local, we can affect global, and we can bring light to the world and bring better feeling to the ultimate level of lighting up the world in our own time through the Judaism that we practice.